Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our webinar today on implications of TNFD on financial institutions. My name is Navina and I represent Capital Markets Malaysia. This session is being brought to you by the Malaysian Sustainable Finance Initiative, and we are fortunate to have the support of the ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Program and its consultant EY, who are leading this session. So just before I hand over to Arina, I just want to go through a few details. The session will last 90 minutes. We'll finish at 4:30. And our speakers for today, we have Arina Koch, who is Partner for Climate Change and Sustainability Services from EY, Elena Almeida, who is Policy Analyst for Sustainable Finance from the Grantham Research Institute, Louisa Richards, EY UK Biodiversity Regulation Lead, and Katie Henry, EY UK Sustainable Finance Biodiversity Solution Lead. So before I hand over to Arina, just to let you know that at any point, if you have a question, you can drop it in the Q&A box. We won't be opening the floor to live questions, but the questions will be answered if you drop it in the box. I'm now going to hand over to Arina to kick us off. So Arina, over to you.
Thank you, Navina. So a very good afternoon. We will first go through a quick introduction before we go in. Now, when we come to focusing on TNFD, very much it is looking beyond what conventional or have looked at when it comes to emissions and nature. So we are going to look at TNFD. And when we talk about nature, it is really coming to understand the frame of nature and related concepts. So there will be a few areas and terminologies that we will introduce in today's session for those who are new or for those who have already embarked on this journey. We first touch on nature. So now when it comes to nature, it does encompass the natural world, including the living elements and non-living elements, with an emphasis on the living organisms and interaction between themselves with the environment. Now, what does this interaction mean? It covers the fresh water, ocean, land, atmosphere, and how this interact with broader society and organizations. So the implication, impact, and the reaction towards its society and organization is going to be the focal area when it comes to nature focus. The second part is when we talk about nature, it's also important to understand the ecosystem services. Ecosystems are very much complex, but if we all understand that our resources comes from the whole ecosystem, then there's a need to also understand that there are complexes when it comes to living plants, animals, microorganisms, and the non-living organisms interaction as part of the functional unit. In a very layman form is the resources comes from the ecosystem. Without understanding the implications or where the critical security of these resources are, there would be potential breakdown of ecosystem, and that threatens not just businesses, it also the broader society, for example, food security. So when it comes to ecosystem services, it is broadly defined as the benefits that people obtain from the ecosystem, and this include regulating services, provisioning services, supporting services, and cultural services. So we will go into a bit deeper in the next slides for context when it comes to Malaysia, but the third part is I wanted to also give an introduction on biodiversity. Now we hear a lot about biodiversity, but what does it entail? So biodiversity covers the focus terminology when it comes to ecosystem and provided services. There are sufficient level of biodiversity and supply of supporting non-living natural resources that is required. For example, diversity of fishes, prawns, or even when it comes to the flora and fauna, we talk about trees. What are the diversity of trees and what are the diversity of animals that we are seeing within an ecosystem that is codependent on each other to thrive and survive and continue to replenish. So biodiversity is really best understood as how rich and the variety among the living organisms at the level of genes, species, or entire ecosystem. Now, we all understand back in our school days for this ecosystem or some of the biology that we take is the moment there is some breakdown, it actually disrupts the whole ecosystem or the one that we we are familiar with, which is the food chain society as well within the ecosystem. So we talk about natural capital. It is closely related to the ecosystem, and biodiversity is in the term of natural capital. It is used to define the stock of natural resources that give rise to flow of benefits to people and the economy in the form of ecosystem services. Now, loss of natural capital is broadly defined as natural loss that can be highly detrimental to the provision of ecosystem services. For example, deforestation, or, for example, reclamation of land that affects the coastal area. Now, these are all activities that actually result in some of the nature loss. So if we go on to the next slide, in Malaysia, biodiversity is definitely a critical hotspot. We consist of Peninsula and the states of Sarawak, of Sabah and Borneo. And this biological diversity is among the richest in the world. Now, the country's forest cover extends to 59% of total land area, and it does include the extensive tropical peatland, which covers more than 7% of Malaysia's total land area. This peatlands stores more than 9 gigatons of carbon, which is almost the size of annual global carbon emission. Now, that's for context according to the World Bank. When we look at the diagram on the right-hand side, for Malaysia, these are the composition of natural capital. You can see that forest covers the largest, followed by cropland, and then subsoil assets, then followed by protected areas, and then the pasture land. So Malaysia's vast shoreline, more than 500,000 of hectares of mangroves. Second is Malaysia's natural habitat nurtures rich variety of life, placing Malaysia as one of the 17 mega diverse countries in the world. So we do have that diversity of the biodiversity that's critical, and being 17 at the global ranking is also demonstrating that level of critical to protect this biodiversity. So Malaysia's rich biodiversity is really critical to sustain the country's economic growth, because many sectors in Malaysia do rely directly on these natural resources within the product processes and business operations. So we go on to the next slide. Now, when it comes to the interconnection between climate and nature, we can see here from the discussion and as well as source reference from Bank Negara Malaysia, and WWF, you can see that in order to drive sustainable development, we always talk about the E, S, and the G, environment, social, and governance. Under environment, climate change, adaptation, and mitigation focuses on climate, whereas biodiversity and other environmental, all three connects to nature, and the broader holistic ecosystem of E, S, and G flow up to sustainable agenda. Now, when we look at climate change and nature loss, they are interconnected challenges that needs to be addressed together. In short, if we are able to address biodiversity, that will contribute to climate change and adaptation strategies as well. So when we look at climate change and nature loss as mutually reinforcing, it's almost finding that wins the critical hotspots or sweet spot that will help to drive value creation or value protection. So for example, the impact of climate change, for example, like rising mean temperature, increased frequency of extreme weather events are the main driver of nature loss. So reciprocally, nature loss can exacerbate the climate change, the trade-offs as well. So for example, for land use change, it can reduce nature's ability to store carbon when you clear land or when you deforest. The amount of carbon storage lessen from the atmosphere, and there are lower regional resilience when it comes to climate change impacts. So underneath, if you look at the last box at the bottom, nature conservation is definitely critical key to climate change mitigation and adaptation. So due to this mutually connected reinforcing relationship, nature is definitely an important part of the solution to climate change. And in terms of mitigation, natural carbon sequestration can be used to neutralize residual emissions by restoring the whole ecosystem, such as forests, wetlands, and peatlands. So in terms of adaptation, nature conservation and restoration can, in many ways, improve resilience to climate change impact. So with that, definitely we do need to relook at the interconnectivity and how these link back to strategy. Now, one thing I'll definitely take a pause for all the participants that have dialed in today is to understand that when you think about handling climate change, climate risk, mitigation and adaptation, connecting biodiversity will broaden your horizon, because using the same pool of funding, you may be able to address both climate change and biodiversity at the same time. So that is where we want to pause and have everyone to reconnect and think back. When you deploy strategy, are you looking first on climate change, which are very common for most businesses and corporates and regulators? But now, when you broaden or you enhance the monitoring processes to include biodiversity, it is using back the same pool of resources, but broadening the knowledge and the impact measurement and outcomes as well. So we go on to the next slide. So when it comes to what banks in Malaysia are doing, and this is very critical because that's where capital flow will drive sustainable development. So for banks in Malaysia, they are essentially highly exposed to nature, physical risk, and transition risk. Otherwise, Bank Negara would not have pushed out further exposures and guidelines, finalization of the climate risk and scenario and mitigation strategies as well. So the top 15 identified nature-related financial risk scenarios by banking sector, commercial loans exposure in Malaysia, we have outlined here from Bank Negara Malaysia's resource that the first is really on reduced ecosystem services due to resource overuse, pollution, and urban sprawl. We also see sudden and unexpected climate policy introduction as being critical, similar to what we have seen on carbon tax in Singapore and the one in Indonesia, and also the plan for Malaysia. There are also ecosystem services deterioration due to deforestation, sudden increase in the price of water, regulatory restrictions of water pollution, change ocean current and circulation, and the rest are also very much talking about sea temperature, flooding occurrence, severe storms, and as well as the looking at the regulatory when it comes to fertilizers, pesticides in the more agricultural sector. So when we look at the coloring or at least the tagging, which are those for transition risk and physical risk, it has also been outlined here. So the connectivity is coming back to understanding how this risk impact the strategy that needs to be deployed. But when we talk about physical risk scenarios, physical risk scenario definitely could emerge from the loss of ecosystem that we talk about, because firm will then now need to understand how this dependency could be direct or indirect via supply chain impacts and relative price changes. In Malaysia, we have seen some shortages of poultry produce, some shortages of manufacturing resources. Those are things that are the hiccups or some of the events of sudden onset events that trigger the ecological and ecological regime shift. And we do see that happening over time. Now, at the bottom, you see the most common that are less shocking or irregular, but the impact could be higher given that the early introduction of transition risk has been communicated, is really on the changes in policy, technology, and consumer preferences when it comes to the nature as a response to nature loss. So they can have substantial impact. For example, customers are now relooking at the choice of products and services that they're looking for. And when we talk about financial institutions, how financing banks are considering biodiversity and ecosystem impact. So if you are a business that has heavy pollution to ecosystem, this is where you have to watch out for. Now, if you are an organization that's very heavily dependent on some of the biodiversity of the ecosystem, these are also where you are open to key severe risks as well. So if the companies or firms do not adapt, the bank will then start to adjust their lending portfolio, consider what are the sector risks, and also start to put in not just emissions consideration, but nature-related financial transition lens to look at how these risks can materialize or will happen in the future. So all these pressure would stem from the domestic changes as well as the important export market. So with that, maybe I can move on to the next slide. So the next part is I would like to introduce Ms. Elena Almeida, Policy Analyst from Sustainable Finance, Grantham Research Institute. Now, Elena is well known in the local landscape. She is a policy analyst for sustainable finance, and she specializes in biodiversity and central banking. She has also worked she's also the research coordinator for International Network for Sustainable Financial Policy Insights, Research and Exchange, INSPIRE Network. She has managed the joint NGFS INSPIRE study group on biodiversity and financial stability, co-authoring the Biodiversity and Financial Stability, Building the Case for Action, and Central Banking and Supervision in the Biosphere. So the NGFS occasional papers. So prior to joining the Institute, I have the personal pleasure to have worked with Elena, who have managed the UK government ASEAN Low Carbon Energy Program and who also worked as an associate economist at Bank Negara Malaysia. So Elena, without further ado, I'm very pleased to invite you to share your wealth of knowledge for this session.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome back.
Thank you so much, Arina. Thank you so much, Arina, for the kind introduction and warm welcome. So in this part of the session, I want to bring a bit more on the central bank perspective, because I think this is relevant in terms of firms and financial institutions thinking about the next steps and what's next in regulation. So just quickly, over the past year, can we go to the previous slide, please? Over the past year, I managed the NGFS INSPIRE study group on biodiversity and financial stability, as Arina had said. This group comprised over 100 participants from central banks, financial supervisors, researchers, and culminated in a final report, Central Banking and Supervision in the Biosphere. This work was intended to increase awareness within the financial sector that environmental related risks extend beyond climate and incorporate things like biodiversity loss, nature loss, and other environmental factors. I started with this. I start by sharing this because I want to bring awareness that nature is very much on the agenda of financial regulators. And as a result of this report, all 121 members of the Network for Greening the Financial System, NGFS members, acknowledged that nature and biodiversity loss could significantly affect the macroeconomy and financial system. The NGFS also then set up a nature loss and biodiversity task force to help embed nature risk within the other NGFS work streams, including things like scenario development and supervision. With the familiarity of actions taken to address climate and the growing knowledge sharing between financial regulators globally, it is possible that these policies on nature will be rolled out quite quickly, and as such, preparations should be made by financial and non-financial firms to understand the firm's exposure and dependency on the natural capital assets, such as some of the things that Arina was talking about. This is even more pertinent now, as yesterday marked the beginning of the biodiversity COP15 in Montreal, where global leaders are set to agree a global biodiversity framework. Specific targets that are likely to be agreed include ensuring that 30% of Earth's land and sea areas are conserved, ensuring that agriculture, aquaculture, and forestry are managed sustainably, and ensuring that all financial flows are aligned with the framework, and that all businesses assess and report their dependencies and impacts on nature. For those working on biodiversity conservation or biodiversity finance, the COP15 is hoped to create for biodiversity what the Paris Agreement created for climate. And that means increased scrutiny on economic activities that harm nature. So this is a very important topic, and I'm glad to be speaking on it. So moving on, why should we care about nature loss? Why should central banks and supervisors care about nature loss? Next slide, please. Biodiversity is declining at unprecedented rates, and irreversible tipping points are being crossed. Looking at the Biodiversity Intactness Index chart to the left, we can see that biodiversity is declining even more rapidly in the Asian Pacific region. Once tipping points are crossed, it could affect the functioning of ecosystem services and impact the production of goods and services. For example, if rainforest turns into savanna, for example, like the Amazon, businesses like soy producers will need to relocate and face higher costs of businesses. And this can obviously be applied to the Malaysian context also. And as we can see from the planetary boundaries framework to the right, these tipping points are already being crossed, including biodiversity integrity. If we don't know what would happen if and when all tipping points are crossed, or if only partial tipping points are crossed. But this is likely to create planetary instability and lead to ecological crisis in ways that we cannot imagine. So think about major flood events, more frequent monsoons, etc. And this could, of course, have an impact on your businesses and the wider economy. Because it is estimated to across a very large set of ecologically diverse animal and plant species, the biodiversity index is quite useful to understand the ability to provide benefits to people. For this reason, it is used in the planetary boundaries framework. Can we go to the next slide, please? Most importantly, Arina also already mentioned this earlier, nature loss is not a separate threat, but interacts very closely with climate and has the potential to create compounded environmental risks, and these are material for businesses. So these impacts are not just happening within the economy, but can create risks for your businesses. Therefore, we must recognize the deep interlinkages between climate and nature. And this necessitates establishing a deeper understanding of the individual drivers, as well as of the compounding and dynamic interaction between climate and nature. Protecting nature will increase our resilience against climate change, and tackling climate change can limit biodiversity loss. Let's turn to the table you see on the right, which provides a breakdown between sources of physical and transition risks and categorizes this into a biodiversity, climate, or compounded risks. If we focus on the first column, physical risk, we can understand that severe weather events like hurricanes or floods is already recognized by the financial sector as a climate risk. We can understand that the loss of ecosystem services like pollinators, for example, the loss of bees or bats, can pose a biodiversity risk. However, climate-related risk can lead to exacerbating biodiversity-related risks and vice versa. In scientific studies, it is well documented that higher temperatures as a result of climate change can weaken the resilience of native species to repel invasive alien species, and this could lead to losses to things like crops. Meanwhile, the spread of invasive species can weaken ecosystems and make them more vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So this can be a vicious cycle that threatens your production processes. And the same can be said about transition risks. We could have policies such as phasing out coal-fired power plants that are clearly climate-related, but we could also have policies to protect specific species or ecosystems that are clearly biodiversity-related. And hopefully this would happen soon as the COP15 concludes in Montreal in a couple of weeks. We could also have policies that affect both climate and biodiversity, for example, policies to end deforestation. Next slide, please. So if we don't address biodiversity loss, this could have effects on financial stability. Physical risks arising from biodiversity loss, such as the loss of pollinators or the loss of provision of timber or fish, can negatively affect business operations, thus affecting the profitability and the ability for firms to repay lenders. This results in market and credit risks for financial institutions. Transition risks can also affect business operations and profitability, particularly for companies whose activities have a negative impact on biodiversity. So transition risks, I hope that you all know from the climate discussions, relate to changes in policy, regulation, technology, and consumer preferences. So this can also be applied to the biodiversity context. And as I mentioned, it could also affect your business operations and profitability. And depending on the magnitude of these risks, the risks to which companies are exposed to may translate into risks for the creditors and for investors. These risks can threaten individual financial institutions, especially those that are highly exposed and to natural capital assets, and potentially aggregate into systemic financial exposures. And thus, this warrants the attention of central banks and financial supervisors. So with regards to financial institutions, it's important to understand which sectors that you are most leveraged in and exposed to. Because, for example, the agricultural sector, for example, is highly dependent on natural resources, or a forestry company, forestry sector is also very highly exposed to biodiversity loss, for example, deforestation or policies to end deforestation. So this needs to be understood so that you understand your entire risk profile and not underestimate the potential risks to your portfolios. Next slide, please. Many emerging markets are highly vulnerable to biodiversity loss, and Malaysia is not excluded. 85% of biodiversity hotspots are situated in the emerging markets and developing economies, with 15 out of 17 megadiverse countries located in these emerging markets and developing economies as well. There are, of course, some challenges and opportunities that this profile poses. So in terms of challenges, the loss of biodiversity, particularly through forest clearing activities, could lead to immediate local impacts. For example, if you participate in illegal logging and clearing of forests in a way that is irresponsible, this could lead to increased severity of floods, or increased occurrence of floods or landslides, which could impact other businesses down the supply chain, or even yours, in terms of logistics, in terms of how much resources you have left, etc. Governments may also consider the protection of biodiversity as a trade-off to achieving economic growth and development. So that there is a lack of understanding that protecting natural resources would actually create a resilient economy. There is still that embedded understanding that you need to clear you need your natural resources in order to pursue economic growth, and this perhaps is something that needs to change moving forward, given as we have seen, climate change is already disrupting the way that we conduct businesses and the way that we go about our day-to-day lives, particularly just thinking about the flood events that are frequently occurring in Malaysia right now. And then in terms of opportunities, central bank mandates and remits can often extend beyond primary price and stability objectives. And this is really the case for Malaysia, where Bank Negara Malaysia also has the mandate to support economic growth, sustainable economic development. So there is an opportunity for central banks in emerging markets and developing economies to take action to prevent or to reduce the risks of biodiversity loss, rather than just focusing on the typically very narrow focuses of central banks and financial supervisors in terms of managing inflation and ensuring financial stability. And then in terms of the benefits, this could lead to the wider central bank remits could lead to support public policy priorities such as financial inclusion, consumer protection, and broader economic development. Next slide, please. So to make the link between biodiversity loss and financial stability, it can be understood that the primary responsibility for confronting the biodiversity crisis rests with governments, notably to overcome the market, institutional, and policy failures that are driving ecosystem declines. A new global biodiversity framework, as I had already mentioned, is expected to be agreed this year in Montreal, or to be agreed in 2 weeks in Montreal. And one emerging priority is to align all financial flows in support of the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, and to encourage firms to understand their impacts and dependencies on natural capital assets. Policy signals by central banks and supervisors can play a complementary role to protect financial stability by reducing biodiversity-related financial risks and helping to guide financial resources to support nature-positive activities. So this is not just something that is important with regards to understanding your risk, but also an opportunity to find activities that actually enhance nature and therefore also help reduce your risk profile and showcase the attractiveness of your business operations within a growing number of consumers and investors that care more and more deeply about ESG issues. And addressing biodiversity-related financial risks falls within the mandates of central banks and financial supervisors. And these risks include the non-linearity of natural processes and possibility of crossing irreversible tipping points. The uncertainty around the scale of these risks is not an excuse for inaction. And as I said earlier, the NGFS is already recognizing biodiversity-related issues as a source of risk. And it can be said that that movements on nature is already beginning within the regulatory landscape. So that brings us to the next slide. What initiatives are central banks and financial supervisors taking to address biodiversity-related financial risk? Next. As we can see from this map with all the little dots, central banks and financial supervisors are already beginning to take action on nature loss. And I want to emphasize that these are just first steps that central banks and financial supervisors have taken to support a more sustainable economy. In the NGFS Inspire report, we dedicated a whole chapter to understanding what actions central banks and supervisors have taken. And in our review of all of these actions, we found 45 different actions that have already been taken. And this was in March 2020. By March 2022, we've seen even more action being taken around the world by central banks with regards to taking initial research assessment and initial research assessments and giving policy signals. In terms of setting prudential policies and instruments, in terms of ensuring that central bank portfolios are aligned to nature positive investments, in terms of supporting the financial architecture through, including through conversations and organizing conferences through the NGFS, for example, in terms of ensuring proper financial market conduct with regards to environmental crimes, in terms of policy liaison and coordination. And we hope to see more action, well, increased action on monetary policy, because there is a price stability impact of biodiversity loss as well, but this is yet to be seen at the moment. So in terms of providing some examples for the prudential side, the Central Bank of Brazil, European Central Bank, and the Monetary Authority of Singapore already include biodiversity in their climate and environmental risk management frameworks. In terms of improving the financial architecture, the People's Bank of China and Bank Negara Malaysia have included biodiversity considerations in their green and climate change taxonomies. And in terms of managing portfolios, the Central Bank of France, the Central Bank of Italy, and the Swiss National Bank have started to integrate biodiversity into their investment portfolios. So the point is that central banks have and are increasingly recognizing biodiversity loss as a financially material risk and action is starting to grow. And hopefully the agreement on the global biodiversity framework will only further catalyze the actions taken on the regulatory landscape. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to leave you with a few key messages. Biodiversity loss is increasingly recognized as a factor to consider by central banks and financial supervisors. Some central banks and financial supervisors are already taking action on biodiversity-related financial risks, and there is now an emerging agenda for action and next steps to take, which can only accelerate with the COP15. So I end my presentation there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elena. So I think we have actually raised for more questions. But I think one question, Elena, if you can take, is what do you feel is the main action being taken by Bank Negara at this point?
Yeah, I think Bank Negara, I mean, sitting in London, actually, it's quite exciting to see leadership being taken by the emerging market and developing economies. So Bank Negara Malaysia is one of the very few, and actually just the second central bank in the world to conduct the nature-related dependency and impact study to understand the financial related the financial risk posed by nature loss. And Arina, you shared some of the findings in your slides earlier. I was also recently in the region to chat a little bit more with some regulators there, including Bank Negara, to understand what are the next steps. And I think this is an emerging agenda. So so in terms of what they have already done, the taxonomy is quite forward thinking in a sense that it extends beyond climate and includes provisions for biodiversity related risks. So I think this is a good step forward. And then in terms of just understanding their own exposures, that could be a possible next step. But their study that assesses the financial system's exposure, that was already quite telling in terms of the fact that they are thinking about this. And that was only the second emerging market study on the topic. So it's quite exciting, and I think it's more of a watch the space of what would happen next. So next year the TCFD will be mandatory, or by 2024 it will be mandatory reporting in Malaysia. But one of the key things is that nature and climate are so entwined that it is much more efficient to address these two things together. And I hope that central banks around the world, including Bank Negara, would recognize this and incorporate this at once rather than by stages, so that it's not seen as two separate things, but climate and nature are two sides of the same coin.
No, that's very helpful. Yeah, Bursa have also finalized that they are including TCFD into the sustainability guide, not just for main market, but also a transition plan for ACE market. And definitely biodiversity is also one of the next to watch out for after the emissions, because it's interconnected to nature. But I think one thing, Elena, the questions that everyone has been asking is, while it's important to measure biodiversity, and I've seen the likes of companies who have reported, like Amuda have reported the IUCN red list species. At least a step one is to measure the richness of biodiversity, that these are not lost. But how can bank measure biodiversity loss? I think when it comes to financial sector, a lot are more critical, trying to connect that to how does that drive valuation, impact, risk, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think it's so difficult if you think about it in terms of species. So there are of course ways to measure species loss through the mean species abundance or potentially disappeared function. And so these are indexes that are already being used within the academic space with regards to measuring biodiversity loss from a financial sector perspective. But these are very difficult things because you need to understand the baseline in terms of species, and I don't think this is very helpful or very easy for everyone to do. But I think what we have to do next is to understand, or what we have to do now is to understand that biodiversity enables ecosystem services to function properly. And so we need to understand what ecosystem services our economic activities depend on. So, for example, an easy example is taking water risk as one ecosystem service, or the availability of fresh water. And a lot of businesses depend on water for producing things. So food and beverage company would need water as a resource for their production. A manufacturing company would need water to clean their products. An agricultural firm needs water for their crop irrigation. And so the so understanding how much you depend on that one resource can be one step in addressing understanding your reliance on natural capital assets. Another key way that you could measure your risk is understanding deforestation risk, and there's already satellite data um, on deforestation risk, locations of potential like important forests. I think there's like a database for globally systemic biomes where you can see like where are the greatest risks for deforestation, and to avoid those areas or understand if your production is located in those areas. So I think narrowing it down to a few key things, like a few key ecosystem services like water and land, is already quite useful, so that you don't underestimate your risks.
Yeah, and one last question, Elena, if I may, from the floor. There are two, but I'll connect it into one because it's interrelated. Now, the key thing is with so many parts of environment to be mindful of, where do you think would be a good start when it comes to nature? So is it a question of tackling all parts of nature or at once, or would it be more prudent to work on forests first before the sea, as an example? So I know you gave some, illustrative of depending on what are the critical ones for the organization. But I think because your experience extends beyond when it comes to knowing the current impact, what we see is when we don't have clear measurements, connectivity, and how to value it, at this stage, as you say, the baselining is the critical step process. But I think where the audiences want to tap on your knowledge is how do we focuses on which area? Sorry, I think Elena may have. Elena, are you there, Elena? Okay, I think we lost Elena. But we will raise the question for the remaining panelists. So maybe
Sorry.
without. Oh, hi,
Sorry.
Elena. No worries.
I can answer it later, I think.
No, you can
Okay.
answer. Yeah.
I didn't hear the question.
So the question is with quite a number of parts, how do they want to pragmatically take the phase approach if resource is a constraint? Do they look at forest first or sea first, as an example?
I think an evaluation of what you are most dependent on. Like if you're a bank, which sectors are you most exposed to? And I think there is a good tool out there developed by the UNEP WCMC, which is called the Encore database, which is not very location specific, but it's ecosystem specific, and matches it to exposures to certain sectors. So if you look into that database, you understand which sectors are most exposed to which ecosystem services. And so from understanding your own portfolio, you can match that to the Encore database to find out which ecosystem services you are most exposed to, and then focus on that one specific ecosystem services. And I think the information from the Bank Negara study with the World Bank on the risks for Malaysia, the nature-related risks for Malaysian financial institutions, showcase that actually surface water risk is one of the key factors. And I think that is possibly a good place to start. If you look at that, even if you are not able to have the resources to understand the Encore database, maybe have a look at the Bank Negara World Bank study to understand what are the key exposure areas for Malaysian financial institutions, and then focus on understanding how to assess the risks to assess your own exposure to like those specific ecosystem services like surface water risk or deforestation, and then focus on the biggest ones first and then move on to the other ecosystem services. But always understand that there's a bigger risk in terms of underestimating your risk. So whatever number you have, I think you have to make sure that you understand that is always going to be an underestimation, because there are so many related nature and climate risks, the interactions that cannot be assessed without very sophisticated tools. So if you do a simple estimation, understand that it's most likely an underestimation of your risk.
Thanks, Elena. It sounds very much similar to the stress testing that is currently being developed for banking when it comes to the climate risk emissions and physical risk as well. So it is enhancing and boosting up the testing of the ecosystem. So thanks, Elena. I think that's been helpful. If you don't mind, it would be very helpful if you can share in the group chat the link to the database. I think that will be helpful for the participants, Elena. I know that you have tapped on, you are the central go-to person when it comes to some of this very rich research that has been done. And we've benefited that a lot from our work back then in JC3. So I'm very happy to have you back. So with that, I think we would like to move on to the next session that we have. I would like to introduce our next speaker. If I can have the next speaker, just a quick introduction of Ms. Louisa Richards. Louisa is a senior consultant in our EY UK Sustainable Finance team based in London as well, seconded to the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD, to support the development of approaches for the financial services sector. So she is passionate to help financial institutions to achieve that strategic sustainable finance ambition and provide recommendation for sector-specific guidance so that financial institutions can actually take a step approach when it comes to how to support in tapping or handling the nature-related risks and opportunities. So Louisa, over to you.
Thank you very much, Arena, and thank you for the opportunity to present today. It's a real pleasure to represent EY UK and to also be able to bring insights directly from the TNFD. Whereas Arena mentioned, I've spent the past 6 months working with insurers, banks, asset managers, asset owners to build out the financial services specific components of the framework. So we've heard a lot about biodiversity loss, how it materializes, particularly in Malaysia, which is such a biodiversity hotspot. And then from Elena about what sort of central banks and supervisors are doing in the nature space. But I now wanted to spend some time providing you with a bit of an overview of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is one of the leading nature initiatives in the market for businesses. So after today's session, you should come away with an understanding of 3 key areas. So firstly, what is the main objective of the TNFD? What are they setting out to achieve? Secondly, what are the core components of the framework for financial institutions in particular? And lastly, how the TNFD differs from the TCFD. I will then pass on to my colleague, Katie Henry, who will provide you with some practical recommendations of how financial institutions can get started today on implementing the TNFD. So what is the TNFD? The Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures is a global, market-led initiative for businesses and financial institutions. It was co-founded by Global Canopy, the World Wildlife Fund, the United Nations Development Programme, and the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative, and officially launched back in 2021. The initiative aims to build upon the success of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, which many of you will be familiar with already, which was instrumental in mainstreaming the issue of climate-related financial risks. The mission of the TNFD differs in that it aims to develop a risk management and disclosure framework for organizations to report on and act on evolving nature-related risks and opportunities. If we look at it from a macro level, its overall objective is to support a shift in global financial flows away from outcomes that harm nature and actually shift financial flows towards outcomes that conserve or restore nature. So this big sort of systemic shift from away from nature harm towards nature restoration. And you'll see on the screen that the initiative has received quite high profile backing, not only from the G7 and G20, but the TNFD is also receiving support and funding from a number of national governments, including the UK, Switzerland, Australia, and the Netherlands. So who's involved in the TNFD beyond those sort of initial knowledge partners? The task force members include 34 executives from a number of different organizations. This includes financial institutions, corporates, and market service providers, including EY. And you'll see a number of probably very familiar organizations on the screen. So collectively, these members manage over 19.4 trillion in assets, and they have a geographical footprint across 180 different countries. So it's really important to stress this is a global initiative, and it's bringing together national governments, NGOs, scientists, and business to come up with a framework on nature. And so these 34 task force members play a crucial role in the framework development process and sit across a number of different working groups that are building out the sort of different components. And you'll see also beyond the task force members themselves, there are actually over 700 organizations around the world that are supporting the TNFD and are involved in the TNFD forum, which is sort of a group of businesses who watch and monitor the TNFD as it's being evolved and take part in webinars and feedback. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So this just outlines the key timelines for the TNFD's development. So I mentioned that the initiative was launched in 2021. So the first version of the framework, the so-called Beta v0.1, was released in March of this year. And that release marks the beginning of an 18-month process of consultation and development together with a broad range of market players and stakeholders. A further 2 releases were published in June and November of this year. And I'd really recommend that you go and look at the TNFD website. They have the framework there and look through and read through the different components because it's a real wealth of knowledge. There will be one more draft release in February 2023, so that's of next year, ahead of the final publication of the final framework in September 2023. So during this 18-month period of development, the TNFD has been actively receiving and incorporating feedback from the market, really ensuring that the framework is practical for businesses. And also worth mentioning that a number of organizations, I think there's been at least over 100 so far, have actually been pilot testing the framework, and that kicked off this summer. And we've seen some really interesting results of how businesses have practically applied the TNFD framework to their unique business models. If we move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So there are 4 specific core components to the TNFD framework. First of all, and this is probably what it's most famous for, are the reporting requirements. The TNFD is much wider than just a reporting framework, though. It's also developed tools to support nature-related risk and opportunity assessments. The TNFD has developed additional guidance on metrics, targets, and data. And last but not least, the TNFD has developed a common language system for nature action. So if we just spend a bit of time looking at each of these components in more detail, starting with the reporting requirements. So the TNFD has developed a set of draft disclosure recommendations for organizations to report on their nature-related risks and opportunities. These are very closely aligned to the disclosure recommendations produced by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which many of you may already use for your climate reporting. And we'll go into what these disclosure recommendations look like in a little bit. The TNFD has also produced a number of tools to support organizations to undertake nature-related risk and opportunity assessments. These include a framework called LEAP, which my colleague Katie will discuss shortly in more detail, as well as guidance on the TNFD's initial approach to nature-related scenarios. Many of you will already had to use climate scenarios across your business models, but there are specific nature risk scenarios which are being developed. Metrics and data will form a real integral part of organizations' approaches to comparing and measuring information and to ultimately inform decision-making. The TNFD recently undertook a landscape assessment and identified over 3,000 different nature metrics currently used in the market. Now that probably sounds quite alarming because implementing 3,000 metrics across your business is just impossible. But one of the key pieces of work the TNFD is currently working on is determining a subset of these metrics which are useful and practical for financial institutions to use and report on. So in a similar way to TCFD, where you have things like carbon footprinting and sort of implied temperature rise, those kind of metrics, they're also looking at those, the equivalent to nature. The TNFD has also developed additional guidance in collaboration with SBTN, so that's Science-Based Targets for Nature, on how you do sort of target setting around a nature goal. As you've heard already, this week we have, very excitingly, the United Nations Biodiversity Conference, COP15, which is happening in Montreal, and where we really hope to agree a global biodiversity framework, which will define a North Star for target setting at the international level. This is expected to trickle down and spur on businesses to set nature-related targets. And it's just important to highlight that the TNFD will closely align with public goals such as the Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as other emerging approaches to target setting, such as the SBTN. Lastly, the TNFD has set out core concepts and definitions around nature and businesses in line with the best available science. So this includes definitions of how you define sort of nature-related impacts, nature-related dependencies, ecosystem services. So if all of the jargon is very confusing, I'd recommend having a read through the sort of common language system that they've set out on their website. It's really helpful in bringing together nature and applying it within a business practice. And as you can see at the bottom, these different components are being developed in a staggered release across the sort of past 6 months or so. So if we now move to the next slide, please. We will now take a bit of a deep dive into the draft disclosure recommendations. So as you can see, these are centered around 4 key pillars. So we've got governance, strategy, risk and impact management, and metrics and targets. So very, very closely aligned to the TCFD, the only slight difference you'll see is instead of in the third column, in the TCFD it's risk management, in TNFD we've got risk and impact management. So that's really looking on how you manage your impact on nature as an organization. In total, we've got 15 recommended disclosures. For those of you that are a bit more eagle-eyed, you will probably realize that that is 4 more additional disclosures than the TCFD. So let's take a look at those differences. So the first one, if we look at the strategy column, and then the disclosure recommendation D, we've got describe the organization's interaction with low integrity ecosystems, high importance ecosystems, and areas of water stress. So really looking at the interface between organizations and nature, with a bit of a prioritization lens on areas that sort of have a really high in biodiversity or low integrity. The next disclosure recommendation to call out sits within the risk and impact management column. So we've got describe the organization's approach to locate the sources of inputs used to create value that may generate nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities. So this disclosure recommendation centers around traceability and ensuring that organizations are being really transparent in their disclosures. We've also got an additional disclosure recommendation within the risk and impact measurement column, which is disclosure E. And this includes references to sort of stakeholders, including rights holders. So it's really emphasizing the sort of the interlinkages between nature and people, especially sort of marginalized communities that sit at the forefront of biodiversity. So sort of indigenous peoples and local communities who are really the champions of nature and protecting and preserving the sort of last biodiversity hotspots around the world. So it's important that businesses are also considering, you know, how they're engaging with these kind of stakeholders. Then we've got metrics and targets. So the one to call out, which is an addition versus sort of the TCFD, is disclosure recommendation D, which is describe how targets on nature and climate are aligned and contribute to each other and any trade-offs. So as we've heard from both Irina and Elena, climate and nature are closely interlinked. Not only does climate change drive biodiversity loss, I think that's a really important driver to call out. It's one of the key drivers of the decline of biodiversity, but also it works the other way in that nature plays a really important role in mitigating climate change. One of the key ecosystem services it provides is carbon capture. Not only, you know, sort of the typical assets we think of like forests or oceans, which do a lot of carbon capture, but actually animals as well. There have been some really awesome studies looking at the role of animals such as elephants and whales in carbon capture. So the two phenomena are really closely interconnected, and for businesses, it'll be important to report on whether there are any trade-offs in your sort of climate strategies, which might be detrimental to nature, synergies as well. So really, the TNFD is marrying these two issues together. And I think it's important to say the TNFD is really driving alignment with other sort of reporting standards. I think one of the key issues we hear from our client at the moment is, you know, there's such an alphabet soup of reporting standards. And what we're seeing is they're trying to harmonize and align and not sort of create new effort unnecessarily for businesses. You'll also have spotted the addition of a few extra words across sort of disclosure recommendations generally. So where in the TCFD, it's very focused on climate-related risk and opportunities, what we have in the TNFD is nature-related risk, opportunities, but also impacts and dependencies. So that the impacts and dependencies have been threaded throughout the disclosure recommendations. So those are the core differences to point out and sort of the new components. But now we'll spend a bit of time looking sort of a level up more holistically on how the TCFD and TNFD differs. So as we've just seen, the disclosure recommendations are based on the same four-pillar approach, and they also build off the foundations of the TCFD disclosure recommendations as a starting point. But as I've mentioned, there is some divergence. We have 4 brand new disclosure recommendations. The other important similarity to call out is that both frameworks align with the ISSB as a global baseline for sustainability standards. So there is harmonization going on across the framework's development, and it's something that the TNFD is very cognizant of. There is a focus on nature-related opportunities alongside risks. I think it's really easy to fixate on, you know, the sort of the risks of nature loss, and it's really important to understand how these materialize across the business. But I also wanted to emphasize that there are opportunities here, and what we're seeing in the market is that financial institutions are being really innovative in creating solutions that address the nature crisis and look to restore nature. So for example, creating products such as natural capital funds or sustainability linked loans with biodiversity objectives, incorporating, you know, biodiversity net gain across real estate development. There's some really cool pieces of work that are happening, and there will be opportunities out there. The other similarity to call out, and I touched upon this earlier, is that the TNFD, as the TCFD has done previously, is developing specific metrics for financial institutions. So there was an initial set of metrics for financial institutions that was published in the November release, and I really recommend you go and have a look at the discussion paper because it shows sort of what's being used in the market currently and what's emerging best practice. And it's helpful to sort of align and see how you might be able to start including these metrics within your business model. So in terms of the new components, I mentioned that there is a sort of conceptual architecture and language system that the TNFD has developed. The other bit to call out is that whereas for sort of climate related financial risk, the TCFD defines it in regards to it sort of as a physical risk and transition risk, but something the TNFD has done in particular has called out nature-related financial risk as a systemic risk. And as Elena has spent some time on showing that it's actually biodiversity loss does threaten financial stability. And I think that's also why we've seen so many central banks and supervisors go out and do really pioneering studies to look at the economy level, how nature-related risk manifests. And many of you probably have come across the statistic, which often gets thrown around, that over half of our global economies are moderately or highly dependent on nature related services. So it just shows, you know, how closely interconnected businesses and our very livelihoods are with nature. The other new component, and I think this is really, for me, this is the heart of the difference between climate and nature, is that biodiversity loss is highly localized. So what we're seeing is location-based analysis is going to be so important for financial institutions. it's not only understanding what sectors you might have exposure to, but it's also understanding, what are the location of your assets? Are you, are you providing a loan to a company that is extracting palm oil in a biodiversity sensitive area? That information is going to be really crucial for financial services to understand. If you're an insurer and you underwrite marine transportation, like what are the routes that those vehicles are going through as they transport across the ocean? So that's a real sidestep in nature versus climate. And there are some really innovative tools and data providers in the market that are sort of growing out their asset location databases. We're seeing, satellite imagery increasingly being used, as well as other things like eDNA, which looks at take samples of DNA from sources in specific locations, and you're able to identify the biodiversity in the surrounding area. So I think that technology is going to be really important, and innovation as well, and enabling businesses to better understand how they impact and rely on nature. So last but not least, before I hand over to my colleague Katie, the TNFD has gone beyond the sort of pure reporting framework and has also produced supplementary guidance on nature-related risk and opportunity assessments. So this is LEAP, LEAP, and science-based target setting. So before I pass over to Katie, I just want to leave you with one take-home message. If you remember anything from today, it's that the TNFD is much more than just a reporting framework. The way that you should think about the TNFD is as a broader change management framework, equipping your organization to integrate nature-related risks and opportunities throughout your business. I will now pass over to Katie, who will provide you with some practical recommendations on how financial institutions can act now.
Maybe, so thanks, Louisa, for that. Maybe before we go down to that, I just wanted to quickly just introduce Katie. So Katie Henry is also from EY UK Sustainable Finance Biodiversity Solution Lead. And her focus is she has worked with UN Women UK on advocacy and regions in addition to sitting on Risk and Governance Committee. So Katie was shortlisted for Young Professional by Women in Banking and Finance and was featured as one of the 30 ones to watch in 2016 Rising Stars of the City for Bravo magazine. So maybe with that, over to you, Katie.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Irina. I don't think I would count as a young professional anymore, unfortunately, but thank you. It's wonderful to be with you here today. It's such a privilege, and it was wonderful to also listen to everyone who's come before me, the introductions to the topic from Irina, the discussion around central bank actions that we've heard from Elena, and the introduction to the TNFD framework that Louisa has taken us through. As Louisa mentioned, the big takeaway from her presentation, which I really would wholeheartedly get behind, is that actually TNFD is so much broader than a disclosure framework. It's a change management framework. And so that is why what I'm going to do is going to be talking about those practical actions that can be taken. And I'll be leveraging some of the components of that TNFD framework to guide it through. So hopefully, as you can all see the screen, I've laid out just a few actions to break down what is a really complicated topic that feels really hard to tackle. So that first action you can see there is reviewing the TNFD framework and the guidance that's available and considering joining the TNFD forum. Action number 2 that we're going to talk about today is going to be about undertaking a materiality assessment across your portfolios and how you might be able to do that so you can better understand your nature-related risks and opportunities. and dependencies. Number 3, in terms of your actions, is starting to assess your tools and external data providers that might be beneficial for you to consider using or accessing to further enhance your analysis and your understanding of your nature-related impacts and dependencies in your portfolio. Number 4, and as emphasized by Louisa, this is not just about risks. It's also about the opportunities and how you can access them. So we'll be talking a little bit through our publication that we recently produced and some of our findings on how those opportunities can be leveraged. And then the last action to consider, which we'll discuss very briefly at the end, is whether you want to consider piloting the TNFD framework yourselves. So my hope is that from this session, you will get more of a bite-sized chunk approach or set of considerations of how you can start to tackle what is such a big and complex topic. So going into the next slide, please. We're going to tackle that first step, reviewing the TNFD framework and joining the forum. So as you'd heard from Louisa, there's a number of different founders, but also a huge number of organizations, in fact, over 800 members of the TNFD. Now, the benefits of joining the TNFD and joining that membership, for me, are really the fact that it's become quite a good community to share your learnings, to access specific information that's been made available, including webinars that outline key elements and provide explanations and further guidance. And it also means that you can learn from those experiences of others in that forum. What I think has been particularly valuable about the TNFD and their forum is that really it means that they're bringing everyone on the journey, so we're all learning how to tackle this together, because it is new to all of us, and sadly there is no silver bullet to it that will guide us through. So I would urge you to consider that. There are other forums, of course, not just the TNFD, that are available. So there's an organization called Finance for Biodiversity, who've set up a forum of financial services organizations that are hoping, I think in 2025, to be setting out their own targets on nature. So they've also created a community, and I suspect there's a number of other communities in this space that will be worth considering joining or contributing to in some way to learn from. So that's step 1. Get familiar with the guidance and find a forum where you can learn from others and how they're tackling it. Easy peasy, right? Step 2, if we move on to the next slide, is I'm going to focus on how you can understand your nature-related impacts and dependencies in your portfolio. So what you can see in front of you is what Louisa referred to as the LEAP framework. I find it quite a good guide in how we can start. So I'm going to talk a bit about this framework before we dive into how you can really tackle it and where to start with it. So you can see along the bottom, we've got the LEAP names. So these are composed of locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. And those are the 4 components of the LEAP part of the framework. So locate really means, where is your business interfacing with nature? So if you're a corporate, let's use Elena's example of a beverage manufacturer, where are your manufacturing premises? And let's say, for the sake of my example, that we are a beverage firm and we've got 2 locations that we operate from. Evaluate then is about identifying what are the nature-related impacts and dependencies that you have as an organization. So if we're a beverage manufacturer, this will mean things like, as Elena pointed out, access to fresh water for the purposes of your manufacturing. That might be a dependency that you have. Assess is then about looking at those nature-related impacts and dependencies and assessing, in amongst that, where are your risks and opportunities. So to make that real for you, if we're the beverage manufacturer and we're dependent on freshwater supplies and we have 2 locations, it might be that in one of those locations, there's particularly high water stress. And so that would be a particular risk for you as an organization. And that really speaks to that importance that was being called out throughout this presentation of the fact of the location. This is the additional complication from climate. Everything in this is location specific. And then the final part, prepare, is really all about what you do from a strategy and a disclosures perspective. So from a strategy perspective, if I'm a beverage manufacturer, I'm reliant on fresh water or dependent on fresh water, and I have 2 locations, one of which has particularly high water stress. If I'm expanding my operations, then I might change my strategy and expand my operations in an area that has less water stress. So I might choose my other factory to expand in. So that's a little bit of a basic, very basic and simplified introduction into the different parts of the LEAP framework. The L for locate, evaluate for E, assess for A, and the preparation for the P part. Now, I know that as financial institutions, you're probably looking at this and being like, oh my goodness, where do we even start with that? Well, this has really been acknowledged in the preparation of this framework. So there is the LEAP FI, so financial institution part of it. And the financial institution part of it that's being added is the part at the top that you can see under the yellow banner. And this is the scoping assessment. There's an acknowledgement because you're slightly less directly linked as a financial institution, actually your entry point and where you should start in the location or evaluation steps of the LEAP framework might be different. And it might be different depending on the items that you can see at the top on the scoping assessment. It might be different because of the type of business you are. It might be different because of the sectors or the geographies that you operate in. And it might be different because of the level of aggregation that's possible in your own assessment at this point in time. And to bring that to life a little bit further, so for example, if I was an asset owner with a real estate portfolio, it might be that actually I do really know the locations of all of my assets. I can start with a geographical analysis. I can look at that location element and understand where I'm interfacing with nature. And that would give me an opportunity to use some tools that look at high risk areas from a nature perspective in terms of geographical location and doing a bit of a mapping against that. Whereas if I'm an asset manager, say, dealing with funds that are largely made up of equities, it might be that actually locations are quite difficult for me to find. And I'm better off starting with perhaps a sectoral analysis. And I know Elena really called this out strongly, and rightly so, because different sectors really have quite clear and often quite, in many ways, quite standardized nature-related dependencies and impacts. So it might be that I start to do that sectoral analysis as my entry point into the LEAP framework. Or it might be something completely different. It might be that I'm a retail bank, I've got lots of different products, and so I want to look at my most material exposures in each of those different product areas as a starting point. So as you can see, we've got that LEAP framework, which provides that nice step-by-step logical guidance, but also the financial services scoping assessment part, which helps us make that more accessible and make it more flexible as a starting point. Scary, I know, right? But let's break it down. So before anyone gets into any quantitative analysis, what we tend to see is everyone starting with a bit of a qualitative assessment and a heat mapping. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. What you can see here is really a mapping of sectors. And this again is something Elena was talking about in great detail. Different sectors have different nature-related risks and dependencies on ecosystem services. And you can see here, this particular version of the sectoral analysis has come from the global insurance sector. They have a sustainable insurance forum, which has some really useful information in it. But there are a number of other analyses that have been performed on sectors. So, for example, the World Economic Forum came out with a paper in 2019 that listed off the sectors that had the highest impacts and dependencies on nature. And the SBTN, so the Science Based Targets Network, have also come out in conjunction with UNEP, WCMC, of an analysis of different sectors and their impacts and dependencies. So that can really provide a good guide and allow you to start with a qualitative mapping of what your sectoral exposures look like. So it's hopefully an easier starting point. But once you've started on that, well, the next step is often looking more at data and your data providers. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. This is a very high-level view. What you can see in front of you is a list of some of the commonly used data providers and how they cover off some of the 4 different realms of nature that you can see listed at the top. But really, there's some key messages here on data. So at the moment, we're still in the early stages with data. Data is challenging. What we find is that no one provider really can cover off all the different parts of the LEAP framework yet. Each provider has very different methodologies they're approaching this with. The data availability is patchy in some areas, and that's because we don't yet have that consistent high quality reporting to rely upon. And then data usability can be challenging. So getting data that you can actually make decisions off. But really, please do not let this put you off. Once you've done that qualitative heat mapping exercise from whatever angle works best for your organization, I do recommend exploring some of these data providers. So the TNFD actually came out with a paper which I found very useful, which mapped different data providers to different parts of the LEAP framework. So once you've done that scoping assessment and you know how to access the framework, it'll then help guide you to what data providers might be most useful for you. And there's other papers out there as well. So Finance for Biodiversity have also released a paper where they compare different data providers and what they provide. And from an EY perspective, we've also put together a mapping of lots of different data providers and what their offerings are and how they compare and how they can be used. So there's a lot of information out in the realms to look at from a data perspective. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to shuffle us along quite quickly. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Step 4, as I said, and as Louisa said, this is not just about risks. This is also about opportunities. There's a financing gap of up to maybe just a bit over 800 billion a year. And the World Economic Forum has come out and said that a nature positive transition could generate up to 10 trillion of annual business value. The opportunities are high. In our recent paper, we looked at the different financial instruments that can be used in the capital markets to really reorient capital into nature positive activities. And you can see some of them listed here under performance linked instruments and use of proceeds based instruments. Typically what we see is performance linked instruments are a little bit more favored because they don't have those restrictions on what happens with the proceeds out the back of them. And also, if you're going to look into this, our paper has guidance on every single different type of instruments and the benefits and the challenges with it. But typically what we saw was green loans, sustainability linked loans and sustainability linked bonds tended to have more mature guidance and really good examples in this space. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. These are some case studies from our paper we pulled out, which can provide really good examples for everyone who's thinking about harnessing those opportunities and leveraging some of those instrument models. Quite a good one is Barclays in the middle. It was a sustainability linked loan and it was to a housing developer. And one of the metrics linked to this loan was really all about whether they were increasing biodiversity net gain in their developments. So that one has been proving very popular and is a good example to look to if you're looking for guidance. If we can move to the next slide, please. So I've rambled through that quite quickly to make sure we covered off the different points, and please feel free to reach out if you've got any questions, but hopefully we've covered off some of these steps. So reviewing the TNFD framework is a really good starting point. It provides good guidance. Consider joining the forum to learn from others. In step 2, consider doing at least a qualitative analysis of where your exposures are from maybe a geographical perspective, maybe a sectoral perspective to understand what that looks like for your business and where you should focus. Once you know where you need to focus, start to think about what data providers are out there. Start exploring those data options and how you can do a bit more analysis. Consider step 4, how you might harness nature-related opportunities as well. And then lastly, when you've done all of these things, and while you're doing them, consider highlighting that TNFD framework or providing feedback if you've used any parts of it, because in that way you're contributing to the guidance and making sure it's as usable as possible for you ultimately, but also for the community. I hope that was useful for everyone, and I'm going to pause there and hand back to Arena.
Thank you very much. I think that has been one very insightful sharing session, Katie. And so we do have quite a few questions, Louisa, Katie, and Elena. I think we want to go through some of it if that's fine for the remaining five. I would say five minutes. We are at 4:30, so I'll just give some quick view. Looking at the approaches, where do you think financial institutions can navigate internally to take on this journey as a good start?
As a good start internally in organizations, I would recommend starting usually risk. Climate started in the risk function, so I'm sorry, risk function people. Often it will start with you, but because there's a disclosure framework in the back, often we also see finance teams getting involved because they tend to own the narrative around this. But I think, sorry, risk function, it'll probably come to you in the first instance.
It's also very similar to the climate related focus areas that we're seeing. So not to add on more to the complexities, as we mentioned, Katie, there should be some correlation between not just the emissions, but diving into the sector focus and portfolio prioritization. So it's once you've built the engine on the materiality, the same set of engines can then be enhanced to cover the TNFD. So TCFD and TNFD have that correlation that rides on the same process and functions. It's just there are additional focus areas when it comes to the risk. So thanks for sharing that. Maybe just a quick pause. I know there is no further questions, but we're happy to take on more if there is. Maybe I'll pass back to Navina if that's okay for the polling session. And in the meantime, it will be good as well for everyone to provide your feedback. So over to you, Navina.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Arena, Alina, Louisa, and Katie for that wonderful session. Ladies and gentlemen, just before you log off, we really appreciate your feedback on these two questions that you see on your screen. This marks the last MSFI session for 2022. Thank you so much for participating in all of these sessions, and do stay tuned for more sessions next year. With that, I'd like to thank everyone, panelists as well as attendees, and I wish you a pleasant evening. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.